Hey everyone, George here, and welcome back to the channel. So we're going to talk about a subject today that we've talked about a little bit in the past, or we've hit on in the past. In fact, I may have even made a video on it here not that long ago, and that is the issue of algae. The number one reason why 90% of all people get out of this hobby is because of the algae. And we're going to talk a little bit today about what we can do to beat back algae. I'm going to give you 7 reasons why I believe that algae happens in our aquariums, and I'm going to give you a couple of tips on what you can do to completely eliminate that problem and never have the issue from the get-go. It is the number one reason, as I said, why people get out of this hobby. As you can see from all of these tanks right here, I do not have an algae issue. If you were to look close up on these tanks, as close as you would like to look at them, you will see that there is not one bit of algae in these tanks. Now, have I ever had an algae problem? Yes, I have. And I got on it early. I figured out the reasons why algae take place, and I did something about it, and I've learned a ton about why algae happens, and I'm going to share that with you today, and I'm going to share with you the tips on how I think you can beat it back and how you can start to love the hobby again, and we're going to do that in just a few minutes. So as I said in my intro, I think the number one reason why most of us get out of this hobby is algae. And it's not unique to you, it's not unique to me, it's just something that happens. And I'm going to try to teach you 7 tips on how you can have algae never happen in your tank, or if you have algae that has developed over time in your tank and is sort of taking the pleasure out of the hobby for you, I'm going to give you some tips on how to eliminate that algae in your tank and see if we can get you back to enjoying the hobby once again. So during this time of giving you these 7 tips, I'm going to talk about some things that all of us probably know, and then I'm going to talk to you about some things that you may never have thought about and you can implement right away. And we're going to start from the very beginning, the genesis of all of this having to do with the setting up of your tank from the get-go. And that's where all of this begins, and this is where all of it ends ultimately, because the setting up of your tank is the single most important thing you will do other than just enjoying your fish and having a good time with the pleasure of watching your beautiful tank being used and occupied by fish that are spectacular. It's a great hobby. It's one that can be very enjoyable as long as we understand that we have to do some things to maintain these tanks in order to be algae free and to also do maintenance just so that our tanks look, well, as good as this one here, which has actually been set up for more than a year. If you look at it, you would never know that because it is so pristine and everything. But the bottom line is that because of the care that I put into this tank, I don't have algae, I don't have issues with many other things, and the hobby becomes that much more pleasurable to me over time. And I hope it will be for you too. So let's teach you some of the tricks that I've learned over these years on how to keep your tank algae free and start enjoying it again. If you're struggling with this, we're going to help you fix that and hopefully give you some tips here that are going to make you smile and enjoy the hobby once again. Yeah, smiling like this. So as I said early on, the main reason why most of us get out of this hobby is because of algae. And algae really comes down to tank maintenance. As you can see, the 3 tanks that I have in front of me, they're beautiful, they're pristine. Each one of these tanks takes approximately 10 minutes to 15 minutes a week to really do any kind of maintenance on them, and all of them, as you can see, are absolutely algae free, and they're beautiful. They just do not take that long to maintain. Maintenance is really everything on a tank. If you put some time into it, the reward for the maintenance that you do on your tank is going to be unbelievable. They're just going to be beautiful, and you're going to really get a lot more enjoyment out of them. It's so frustrating when we see algae grow in our tanks or take over, and the reason, like I said, is that if we don't do the maintenance that we're supposed to do, then we're going to see those kind of problems crop up. I'm going to teach you how to take care of that to make sure that you're not getting algae in your tank by doing that tank maintenance. And we're going to start with the number one thing, and it starts from the very beginning, the very genesis of all of this, and that is cycling your tank properly. And we're going to talk about that because we ask ourselves, what does cycling your tank properly really mean? And that's a fair question, and I'm going to talk to you in a minute about that. What I mean by the cycling of the tank is cycling the tank correctly and doing it in such a way that you are doing the cycle to the maximum potential for you to have a successful tank. Now, there's a lot of people out there that will tell you that you can instantly cycle a tank, and that's true, you can do that. But do I believe that that's the best way to get your tank off the ground? No, I do not. I have done it. I'm not going to say that I haven't done it, because I have, but I've done it with the tanks that are all around this fish room here, and I've seeded them with tanks that I know have good beneficial bacteria in there, that I can start these tanks off immediately in good shape. But I don't generally, as a rule, do it that way. I cycle my tanks in the way that most people who are just getting into the hobby, as you might be doing, in a way that takes a little bit of patience. And what I mean by that is, if you don't have patience for this hobby, as I said a few minutes ago, this hobby is probably not for you. Now, it doesn't have to be a daunting task. It doesn't have to be an incredibly difficult task for you. It can be simply that you have to take the time. I don't know how many tanks you're planning on having, but let's just say you have 1 or 2 tanks a week. You should be able to maintain these tanks in this pristine of shape just by spending between 15 and 30 minutes a week on each one of these tanks. If you don't have that, then you really shouldn't be in this hobby. Now, when I talk about cycling the tank, what I'm really talking about is starting the tank from the beginning. I'm talking about putting your substrate in. I'm talking about putting your hardscape in, which is your rock and your wood. And then I'm talking about putting your plants in and and then starting the cycling process. Now, that process usually takes between 3 to 4 weeks if you do it correctly. Sometimes it can take a little bit longer depending on some outside influences that you may not have planned on, or things that come up that are unexpected, and those are just things that happen and can create an environment where your tank just isn't going to cycle in the time period that you hope. But the number one thing that you have to have is patience for this, because when you are cycling a tank, you can be guaranteed that that tank is not going to cycle for at least 3 to 4 weeks. At that point, you're going to be checking your water parameters. You're going to be checking all kinds of different things to make sure that the environment is suitable for fish. Once the environment is suitable for fish, the very next thing you're going to do, instead of just throwing a whole ton of fish in here and saying, oh great, look at them, man, they're swimming around, it's beautiful and whatever, that's a recipe for disaster. When you start stocking your tank, we're going to talk about a little bit later in this video on how I believe you should stock a tank. But let's get back to the cycling portion of this. What you're going to see happen in that 3 to 4 weeks is you are going to see a small amount of algae building up in your tank that is called brown algae, which is scientifically called diatribe algae, which is stuff that is normal for a freshly cycled tank to have. It's not something that's unusual, but there's a way to even avoid that if you have the discipline and the patience to do the cycle correctly. Now, when you are cycling a tank to avoid algae in a brand new tank that you're just setting up, you have to discipline yourself to change 50% of the water in your tank every single day for the first 7 days. Now, there is a product out there, and it's called Stability by Seachem. I would normally have that sitting out here, but I don't want to advertise for them because they're not paying me to do this video, and nor am I trying to sell their product. There are other products out there that do the same job. I just happen to use Seachem for mine. What you're going to do, say for example, if you're using Stability by Seachem, what you're going to be doing is as you do those 50% water changes every day, you're going to follow the instructions on the back of that bottle, and you're going to add in this product called Stability with each one of these water changes, which eliminates ammonia automatically, number one, and it also controls what I call new tank syndrome. And that is when your tank totally gets out of whack in the middle of a cycle. If you use a product like Stability and you're doing these 50% water changes every single day for the first week, and then adding in this Stability, you don't have to do it past 7 days. After that, the tank should be in very good shape, and you can move your water changes to twice a week and do the same thing. 50% of the water changed twice a week. That will get your cycle going in a way that is proper for starting a new tank. And after that, you're going to stay on that program, but you're going to reduce after, say, 14 days. It's a good example of where I think you should be. After 14 days, you're going to do a quarter water change every single day. Make sure you're putting dechlorinators in your water, or if you're letting your water sit out overnight and you're going to use that kind of water. Most of us don't have that kind of discipline or ability to do that, but if you are doing these water changes, make sure you are adding in some dechlorinator. There's several different kinds out there. Seachem makes one called Prime. There's just all kinds of them out there on the market. All of them are good. All of them are going to achieve the same thing. They're going to take the chlorine out of your water that your city has likely been adding to that water that's disruptive to the cycle and is not good for your tank. So you have to use these dechlorinators in order to get a chlorine-free environment during this cycle. Now, once you've reached your 3 to 4 weeks, you're going to do your water parameter checks. You're going to check for ammonia, nitrites, nitrates, and your pH. These are the 4 most important things that you're going to be looking for when you're cycling your tank to make sure that you have got your tank in a situation where it is cycling through and doing what it's supposed to be doing. Now, most people think you have to have a fish in here or some kind of life in here in order to get that cycle going. That is not the case at all. In fact, what I would tell you is using the product Stability and doing it according to the instructions on the back is going to add in that bacteria that you need and build on it and build on it and build on it until your cycle is done and your tank is stable. The worst thing you can do is put fish or shrimp or snails or anything in this tank for that first 4 weeks, and that's where patience comes in. If you are doing that and you're leaving the tank, look how beautiful this tank is. Let's just say there were no fish in here. Look how beautiful the tank is. That's, in my opinion, just as nice to look at as if you had fish. Of course, fish are going to add that 100% just absolute beauty to the tank that you want, but to look at this for 4 weeks is not a lot to ask because it's beautiful. It is an absolute beautiful natural environment that you're eventually going to add fish to, and that's the excitement. It was when we reached that goal and we've disciplined ourselves for that 3 to 4 weeks that it takes to cycle the tank, and then we can start to add our fish in. And we're going to come back in a few minutes and we're going to talk about the next 6 things that we need to do, and we're going to go a little bit faster because I don't want this video to be an hour long or anything like that, because people are going to lose interest in it. But I'm going to help you talk about the last 6 things here and give you a few more tips on how, if you already have algae in your tank and you haven't done these things to get these tanks to where they are in this particular environment here, what I'm going to do is tell you what you can do to eliminate that algae. And in some cases it's going to be pretty radical, and in other cases it's going to be fairly simple. And we're going to get back to that in just a few minutes. So your tank is all set up and you're ready to put fish in there. But one of the things that I want to talk to you about before we get into that is I want to make sure you understand that the more plants that you have in the tank, the heavier the plant is, the plant volume is in your tank, the less chances you have of having algae problems. And I'm going to tell you why. The more plants that you have in there, any organics that are in the water and anything that is creating an environment for ammonia or nitrites or nitrates or anything like that is going to be used beneficially by the plants that are in your tank. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is because one of the most important things that you should do when you're starting an aquarium, and I should have talked about this in the very beginning of this, but I didn't, but we're going to make sure we cover it because it's just so important to me that you understand this. If you can spend as much money as you possibly can on planting your tanks, similar to something like this here, you are going to benefit by that, because those plants are going to soak up and use all the organics that generally cause algae to grow in your tank. So if you have a lot of plants in your tank, algae doesn't get a chance to compete with them, because the plants in your tank are going to use every bit of resources that it can use in that tank to grow themselves. Therefore, algae competing with them doesn't stand a chance. These plants are going to take up so much more of the organics and use them in your planted environment, and never get that algae a chance to even get started in there. Now, like we talked about, the brown diatribe algae that we all see in a tank is something that we're going to talk about next, and that is going to be the stocking of the tank and how important it is to go extremely slow when we start to stock our tanks. Now, we've waited 3 or 4 weeks for the tank to cycle, and we've been very patient with all that. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to get some fish in there, because we want to make sure that we're being emotionally satisfied, because we've been patient and we need to be rewarded over the fact that we have waited 3 to 4 weeks for this tank to cycle, and now it's time to stock the tank. Now, the biggest mistake that people make is they stock the tank so heavily that the bio load that takes over in that tank becomes so far out of whack with what the tank can handle that you just within weeks start to see some algae growth in your tank. What I want you to do is to have some more of what we call discipline. I asked you to do that earlier on the cycle. I'm going to ask you to do it again because it's so important in this second tip that I'm going to offer up to you, and that is to do not load your tank. I don't think I said that right. Let's try that again. Do not load your tank up with so many fish that you throw the bio so far out of whack that it's just a big mess within a couple of weeks. What I want you to do is add the most important fish first, and those are the very fish that are going to not only keep your algae down because you're not overloading the bio, but they're actually going to use that algae as part of their diet. So that algae is actually going to be put to use. Anything that even gets started. In other words, you don't even want to see algae get started in your tank. And if you have the right species of fish and combination of algae eaters in your tank, you're not going to see that happen. So the first thing I want you to do is to stock your tank with some snails. Now, nearite snails or mystery snails are the most common out there and the least expensive. There are some other types of snails out there that cost quite a bit of money that will do the job for you, but I am talking about doing this on a budget, so I'm recommending to you that you get, this is a 20 gallon here for a 20 gallon or a 10 gallon, I think, or even a 5 gallon. If you're talking about a 5 gallon, let's start there. I think 2 or 3 snails, nearite snails, they come in some beautiful colors. I mean, the colors are really quite extraordinary. Some of them are even robin's egg blue. They're red ones with black dots on them. There are ones that look like a watermelon. There's ones that look like they have a crossing pattern on them, and they're just all beautiful. And if you find a good supplier that can supply you with nearite snails or mystery snails, you add those to your tank, wait about another week to 2 weeks, just leaving the snails in there, and then I want you to go to the next step. From there, I want you to go out and find a pleco fish. Now that is a plecostomus, and most of them are bristlenose, and there's a zillion types of plecos out there. They're probably the most diverse group of aquatic fish that you can find out there, and there's one that'll fit every imaginable tank out there as far as color, size, all kinds of different things. What I recommend if you're dealing with a 5 gallon, 10 gallon, or 20 gallon tank, that you get something that's going to be fairly small, and that would be the dwarf albino pleco, which is what I use in most of my tanks. Now, I have made the mistake of buying a pleco that I didn't really pay attention to how big it was going to get, and you don't see these very often in your tank. Most of the time they're out at night and they're foraging around, eating any algae off every leaf that they can think of and or see in your tank, and that's the time that they're out and about. In fact, if there's not enough algae in your tank, these bigger plecos can starve to death, and they'll get what they call sunken belly syndrome, and you can tell that they're on their last leg because they're just not getting enough to eat. So make sure that if you're doing a 5, a 10, or a 20 gallon tank, which is the most common size, that you get yourself a couple of these dwarf albino plecos that are going to do the job. They're going to go around and they're going to clean up all of the algae that is anywhere in your tank along with those snails. Now, if you're going to have a tank where shrimp can live, that would be your next thing that I would tell you to add to your tank, is go out and find some beautiful shrimp out there, some cherry shrimp, some velvet blues, some orange shrimp. There's endless amounts of colors and varieties of shrimp out there that you can buy, but you have to keep in mind that if you're going to stock your fish with larger fish, that these shrimp are going to be very vulnerable to being eaten by the larger species in your tank of fish when you finally get your tank stocked to where you want it. So keep that in mind early on so you don't make that mistake later and find that your shrimp are being killed or eaten by these larger fish. So if you're going to have a tank that has smaller fish in it, probably a nano tank of some kind with smaller fish like ember tetras or chili rasporas or neon blue rasporas, harlequin rasporas, cardinal tetras, all of these are going to be safe fish for you to put in with the shrimp that you already have in your tank. But if you're going to anything bigger than that, such as even South American cichlids, such as the German blue or the golden dwarf cichlid or electric blue cichlids, these are all dwarf cichlids from South America. They are going to make a really bad environment for your shrimp, and they're going to disappear one by them picking on them. So you got to be really thinking ahead every step of the way what you're going to add to your tank and how that's going to affect things overall. But like I said, you want to add some snails, you want to add some shrimp if your tank is going to be able to withstand or if your shrimp are going to be able to withstand the size of fish that you put in there, and also some bottom-eating fish, and well, not bottom-eating fish. We're going to get to that in a second, but algae-eating fish such as plecos, and I would recommend the albino pleco is a perfect fish for that tank. Now you can buy some regular size plecos that are small, but you're going to have to be disciplined and get them out of there as they start to grow, which is very, very difficult. In a tank like this where you have this much planting going on, it's almost impossible to catch them. You will absolutely destroy your tank trying to catch them. So keep that in mind so you just save yourself some heartache down the road and you don't have a situation where your plecos are too big for the tank and you can't catch them now, and they're just raising hell with your tank, digging up your plants and re-landscaping everything unintentionally, but re-landscaping your tank. So now you have in your tank some snails that are algae eaters. You have some shrimp that are algae eaters, some of the best out there. They're constantly eating. And you have a pleco that is a type of algae eater. Now, one more fish that I would recommend to you if you can get them to get along with your other fish, and that is the Siamese algae eater. Don't confuse these with other varieties that are sold out there as Siamese algae eaters and are not truly Siamese algae eaters, because that's going to create problems for you later on too. But the last thing that you want to add to this tank before you start putting your regular stock of fish in there is one of my very favorite fish. They're cool, they're beautiful, they come in so many different varieties, and they're just neat fish to watch and fun to look at, and you can enjoy them all day long. They don't hide, they're not fish that only come out at night or that sort of thing. They're fish that are definitely going to be out and about and foraging for food all the time, and that is the Corydora. They come in so many different varieties. If we're talking about a 5, 10, or 20 gallon, I'm going to recommend a couple of different species to you. The pygmy Corydora, or pygmy Cory, is a great one. The Julie Cory is a great one. The Panda Cory is a great one. Those three right there, I think, are going to fit most tanks really well, and those are bottom feeders. In other words, those guys are constantly going along the bottom of the tank and cleaning up any food that is left over from your fish that they don't quite get. And that's really important, because without those, you're going to have leftover food, and that again is going to throw your bio out of whack, and you're going to have the environment where algae can grow. Now, one last note on this, and we're going to get on to number 3 here, And that is that if you are buying corydoras or cory fish, cory catfish as most people will call them, do get them based on the size of your tank as to how many you get. In other words, if you have a 5-gallon tank, get a minimum of 3. If you have a 10-gallon tank, get a minimum of 6. And if you have a 20-gallon tank, you can put as many as 8 in there, because these are very social fish. They're schoolers. They like to be around others of their own kind. And in fact, you can mix them up a little bit. The Julies and the Panda, Tetras, or Corys, will not school together, but they will hang out with each other. They do recognize that they are slightly different from each other, but they do recognize that they're cory fish, just as cory catfish, I should say, just the same. So that's my number 2 on this whole thing, and we're going to get to number 3 in a minute here. And I think this is probably the most important of all of these that we've talked about so far. And we're going to do that in just a second here. So the third and probably the most important component of your tank is going to be your lighting. Lighting is everything, because all the plants in your tank, in order for them to thrive, they have to be in the right light conditions. So if you've thought out your layout on your plants and your tank, and you've thought about what kind of plants you want to be in there, whether they be low light plants, whether they be low to moderate lighting plants, or they be high light plants, it's really important for you to think about that when you're putting your tank together, and make sure you understand fully what the needs of those plants are going to be. Now, most of the lights that are out on the market today are LED, and they have a lot of possibilities that come with them. Many of them come with apps that you can put on your phone. Many of them come with the ability to program them in different ways that allow you to have them go off and on at certain times of the day. Also having them come off and on 2 or 3 different times during the day. As well as having a sun up type scenario where the tank slowly lights itself in the morning. That is one of my favorite features, because it's also good for the fish. It gives them a more natural environment to wake up and get their day going. And the same thing with the tank going off in the evening. It's important that we keep in mind that these fish, if you're going to have a sun up type scenario, that having a sundown type scenario, same thing, where the lights just gradually turn themselves down slowly until they finally turn off at the end of the evening. Now, light is important for lots of different reasons. Number one, they help your plants to grow and thrive. Photosynthesis only happens when lights are on. If you are using CO2 with your tanks, which I do not use CO2 with most of my tanks, I started off in the hobby believing that I needed CO2, and quickly realized that I did not need them, that my plants in my tanks grew just as well without CO2. Now, as you can see, this tank in front of you here that I'm displaying right now is not a tank that has a lot of really sophisticated plants in here. We have mostly some crypts down in the bottom area here along the front. This one here is a crypt as well. This is a bronze one that has been in here for a while. These I just added within the last month or so, and they're just starting to take off. These are not expensive plants. These are plants that you can get tissue culture, or you can get them already established in a little cup. Also, I do have Petite Nana Anubias in here, and I also have several different kinds of Anubias in here, which I don't want to go through all of them because it's going to take me a while to figure out which each of them are. We also have some more bronze crypts down in here. Those down here are low growing, as well as these will be also. When I say low growing, I don't mean that they're going to stay the size they are. They will establish themselves and get higher over time, but that just comes down to trimming them back periodically. Also, you're going to see in here that there are small patches uh, of different kinds of mosses in here that I have put in. There's some Christmas moss on the other side. These are basically just small patches of regular moss that are really easy to just super glue down. That's something that's really important on your plants. We're getting away from lighting a little bit, but I thought I would throw this in there. Super gluing your plants to the rocks, especially those that are floating plants and do not require to be held down by the substrate. It's real important because you're going to have certain fish that are going to be very disruptive in here, and it's really important that you super glue these plants down and give them a chance to root around the objects around them. For example, if you look at this plant right here, it's been in here for so long that it really has attached itself over time. Forget the ringing there, it'll go away in a minute here. But these plants have basically attached themselves to not only the rocks but the wood in here, and wrapped themselves around and anchored themselves to this environment that there is around them. And this gives them a chance to stabilize and make it so that the fish like the plecos that are moving around, or the cories in the evening that are moving around, or even some of these larger angels that may be picking at them or whatever, just trying to find little traces of food, that they move around as well and can be disruptive to your plants. If your plants are well anchored and if you've put them in there, like I said, from the beginning, by the time you start putting your fish in your tank, you are going to find that these plants are well anchored. Getting back to the lighting portion of this, like I said, there are many different types of lights out there. They're not as expensive as they used to be. You can still spend a tremendous amount of money if you are, for example, doing a reef tank, or you're doing a tank that is really, really large and has some very sophisticated plants in there. There are a zillion lights out there, and there's something for everyone. And most of them, in the world that we're living in today, do have capabilities that we could only have dreamed of 10 or 15 years ago. So there's no reason in the world that you can't find a light that is very much suited to the plants that are in the tank that you have, or if you have multiple tanks, every one of them is going to require slightly different things. But it's so important that you understand the requirements of the plants that you have, and that lighting is the number one thing that's going to make those plants thrive, and also make it easier on you once you've adjusted the light to the environment of the plants and things are going well. You may have to make a few adjustments here and there. You may have to, like I said, if the light only goes down to a certain brightness, you may have to put up the top here some kind of a pad that is going to diffuse some of that light or disperse it differently, and that's going to help also in keeping especially hair type algae from growing on the tops of them. Now, I think that all light should sit at least a half a foot above the surface of the water, and the reason for that is because they now get the proper disbursement of rays from that particular light, and that is very helpful in making sure that your plants stay healthy. If they don't get enough light, the plants are going to tell you that. If they don't get enough fertilizer, your plants are going to tell you that. So adjusting those lights up and down are easy to do. The best way to tell if your plants are having trouble is to look at them periodically and see how green they were. In other words, when you first set up your tank, take a picture of the tank or a video, compare it to what 6 months down the road that the tank looks like, and you will be able to see if your plants are deficient in any way by looking at the color of them. If they are not bright green, if they are not a really just nice color green, then they're probably having problems getting enough light, and you're just asking for, if you have other things out of whack, say your bio's out of whack or whatever, you're just asking for these plants to start allowing algae to grow on their leaves, because like I said, they're the tallest portion of your tank, and the first place that algae is going to grow is on the highest points in your tank, and that would be where your plants are. That's enough about lighting. We're going to get into number 4 in just a second here. Hang in there with me. We're almost on these last 4 are going to go rather quickly, and we're going to get to that in just a second here. Number 4 on our list is water changes. Oh, wait a minute. That's not water. Sorry about that. I knew that wasn't water. Being serious though, water changes, 4th on my list. It's so important to me that you understand the importance of water changes. Now, we talked about water changes during the cycle period, but we did not talk about water changes as a maintenance feature for all of your tanks. The most important thing that you can do to maintain your tanks is to make sure that you are changing water in your tank on a regular schedule. So what I suggest, and has worked for me, is that you do at least one water change that is about a quarter every single week, at least 2 times a week. Now, I know that sounds like a lot of work, but if you're talking about a tank this size here, which is 7.13 gallons, we're talking about it takes literally 10 minutes to do that. You already have your water set up. You know after a while about where your water level needs to be taken down to. You just use a siphon hose with a little bucket or bowl, whatever you have on hand. I recommend going down to the Lowe's and getting one of those small little paint buckets. They're great for tanks this size. Get a little piece of siphoning tube that's at least that big around. Get anything smaller than that, it's going to take forever to siphon the water out of there. But doing regular water changes is so important, and I recommend that you get yourself on a schedule of doing that twice a week, whatever days you want to do that. Try to be consistent about it, because if you're doing it Tuesday one week and Thursday and Sunday on another week and Monday and Friday on another week, it's just going to get you all out of whack. Get yourself on a regular schedule for whatever amount of tanks that you have that you're going to try, unless you have as many tanks as I have, which is a lot. You can't do them all in one day, but if you do only have a few tanks and you're able to do this on a schedule where a couple of times a week, I got to shift again here, I got a bad foot. A couple of times a week, you're able to do 1/3 of the water in there. It's going to make all the difference in the world on how many organics are removed from that water and how clear that water remains. Now, this glass here is low iron glass, so it's kind of not fair, because what you're seeing here is probably not something that you're going to have starting out. If you can get low iron glass, I recommend that. It's a little bit more expensive than regular glass, but if you can find low iron glass, I really recommend it to you, because it is so higher, so much higher quality than standard glass. Unless you put them side by side, you're not going to know, but you would know if you've if you come across low iron glass, because it's absolutely spectacular as far as what it looks like. In fact, don't go near low iron glass unless you tend to buy it, because it's going to spoil you and you're going to end up not feeling like you got the right glass. But anyways, if you've got a tank this big here and the one next to it here, these two tanks, it takes literally 5 to 7 minutes per tank to change the water in these. And be careful though. If you do have more than one tank in your home and you are doing water changes, you don't know what's in this tank as opposed to that tank. Even though both tanks are part of your family of tanks here, there can be some issues going on in this tank that this tank doesn't have, and you don't know about it. And you can introduce those same parasites or anything else that might be happening in this tank that may never show up, but may show up in that tank with a different species of fish. So you have to be extremely careful that you are using a different siphoning tube for each one, so that you do not get yourself into a situation where you are putting water or tubes that are dirty, and nets the same thing. If you're netting fish or whatever, make sure that you're changing those things out. But do a quarter water change twice a week on your tanks, and it's going to go a long ways towards taking the organics out of that water and keeping that bio load down to a level that's manageable for the tank to just take care of it, and the fish and the snails and the shrimp or whatever else you have in there are going to keep you doing that. Now, the only way to know that is over time. You're going to learn your tank, you're going to understand your tank, you're going to understand the behavior of your fish, you're going to understand the requirements that your fish have, and you're going to know that your fish are different in every single tank, and therefore the cleanliness of the water is going to be important, that you always have an idea of how clean the water is in each individual tank. My recommendation is, if you do both tanks or all of the tanks that you have on a schedule, and they're all done on the same day, it's just easy. You just go through, boom, 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 and they're done. And like I said, if you've just got a few tanks or you have one tank, we're talking 15-20 minutes of your day twice a week. That's not a lot to ask, and it's so easy to do, but it's so important that you do that. And now we're going to go on to number 5, which I think is something that we don't think about, but we do every single day with our fish, and that is feeding. Now, when we're feeding our fish, you want to give your fish as much food as they can eat in a period of 3 to 4 minutes. If you're doing something where the fish are taking longer to eat than that, then you're not doing something right. Your fish are just going to let the food go to the bottom. Maybe your Julie Corys or your Panda Cory Doras, Panda Cory catfish, whatever you want to call them, are going to eat the remainder of that food, or maybe they're not. It's just really depends a great deal on you knowing your tank and understanding how often your fish are being fed, and whether or not these fish are allowing some of that food to get to the bottom and never be eaten. Because a lot of times when the Corys have had enough, they're just going to go park themselves in your tank and take a time out, and that organic matter that you just put in there as far as food is just going to really taint your tank. And once it gets tainted, it's hard for it not to turn into organics that are eventually going to create an environment for algae to grow. So having said that, feeding, get on a good schedule. I feed my fish twice a day. I feed them small amounts, but I also fast my fish 1 day a week. So I fast my fish on Sunday just because it's easy to remember. We fast on Sunday for religious purposes. If you have any religious background, we all know that a lot of people fast on Sunday. So I just do that simply because it's easy to remember. Now, going on to number 6 here, I think this one is important in a sense that it goes that extra mile to keeping your tank clean. What you want to do is set yourself up on a regular maintenance of your tank. Now, maintenance you may think is just a water change here and there and picking off some dead leaves or whatever. That's not what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about maintenance, I'm talking about a thorough maintenance of your tank. Now, you want to do that about every 2 to 3 months, depending on how big the tank is, how big the bio load is, meaning how many fish that you have in there, and really knowing your tank and understanding when it's time to do that maintenance. Some things are very obvious. Plants sometimes need to be clipped back. For example, these repens down here, I just clipped back the other day. I want them to be shorter than the crypt in the back right here because that's the way this tank is laid out. It's laid out in a way that the repens in the front here are supposed to be my low growing ones. Now these repens will grow way up here if you allow them to, but they're not meant to do that. They're meant to be more of a carpeting plant, and to keep them cut low, you don't have to cut them real low, but keeping them low to look like a little shrub in your yard or something like that is really important. But the other thing that's really important is to vacuum your tank out with a siphon hose. So now we're not talking about a regular standard changing of the water in your tank, but we're talking about siphoning this tank out with a larger piece on the bottom. You'll find these, they're not very expensive at your store. They go anywhere between $10 to $19 depending on what you're buying. If you're buying a more sophisticated one that has a valve on it that shuts on and off, they can cost up to $30, but you don't need to spend that much money on something that you don't use that often. So if you're going to keep your substrate really clean, you gotta vacuum it occasionally, and that just means running along here, sticking that down in around. If your plants are well rooted, they're not going to pop up, they're not going to come loose, and when you're done doing that, going as far as you can, most of your feeding is going to happen. You're going to notice this. When you feed your fish, you typically feed them in the front here. The food hardly ever makes it to the back of the tank. So, having said that, focus on the areas with the most substrate visible and available to you to vacuum it up. And you're going to find that you're going to get a tremendous amount of waste out of there, poop from the fish, extra food, dead leaves, all kinds of stuff that collects on the bottom of your tank, and is so important to get it out of there, because that is, as much as anything, is going to create an environment for algae to grow. Algae thrives on something that is a common denominator in everything that I've told you so far, and that's the organics that are in your tank. In other words, the things that you're introducing to your tank to feed your fish, the waste from your fish. Fish urinate. People don't even think about that, but they do. They urinate. They have kidneys and bladders just like all creatures do. And so therefore, we have to make sure that when we're doing the water changes, we're getting rid of that stuff that's in the water, the urine and stuff. But we forget sometimes that the poop and stuff is in the substrate, and that has to be removed periodically just so that you have a clean and pristine tank. Now, the fourth thing I want to talk, or the seventh thing that I want to talk about that is important, is keeping the glass on the inside of your tank clean. There's a couple of ways that you can do this. Every time I do a major maintenance on a tank, I go in with a sponge and I go all along the inside with the very coarse side of the sponge. You don't have to buy anything special. You can use anything that you can purchase at a store that's used in a kitchen. Just use it for your fish only. Make sure that you've got it in a place where somebody isn't going to use that for cleaning other things in your home, because if they get cleaners on there, you're going to kill a whole lot of fish really quickly. So make sure that when you get a sponge and you're using the coarse side of that sponge, that you go all around. That's why you want to plant all of your plants at least this far from the edge of the tank so that you can get in there and clean. If you can't get in there with a sponge, get in there with a credit card. A credit card is the perfect thing that keeps you from going out and buying things and getting in trouble with your wife. Number one, buying too many fish for your tank. Yeah, you can never buy too many fish, but use a credit card of some sort in here and just scrape up and down the walls of the tank all the way around. You don't have to worry about the backside. And then take a toothbrush. Take a toothbrush that's old and has very soft bristles on it, and go along and clean everything. All the sides, all the back, every component that you can see. And like I said, you don't have to do this every water change, but on your main maintenance, this is the time to do it. When you're doing that substrate with the vacuum on it and cleaning the poop out and everything, it's a perfect time to do that. Do that though before you do your vacuuming, because a lot of stuff's going to come off these walls sometimes, and then it's just going to free float in your water after you've already done the vacuuming, and that defeats the purpose. What you want to do is do the credit card or the sponge or the toothbrush, whatever you happen to be using to clean the walls of your tank. Do that first, and then go along and clean with a vacuum so you get everything that's loose in your tank. You can also go along with that wider edge thing and vacuum your leaves off. One of the things that I do is, after I've scraped everything down and I've disrupted all of this right here, before I do the water change on that, I go along with a turkey baster. Turkey baster. Turkey baster is good for lots of things. You go in and you squeeze it, and anything that's on the leaves that's loose, squeeze it very lightly, just enough to push it off the leaves and let it settle in the lower parts of your tank where it's supposed to, and it just makes all your plants just look perfectly pristine and pretty as the way they're supposed to. Do the same thing along your wood and your rocks, and you'll have a perfect environment. Like I said, if you're doing a good balance of maintenance on your tank and all the things that I talked about, and everything is set up the way that it's supposed to be, you've used patience in cycling, you've done good maintenance on your tank, you've got proper lighting, you have proper substrate, you have a lot of plants in there to absorb the organics that are going to be in your tank. If you're doing all of those things, I can guarantee you, my friends, that if you are not 100% algae free, you are going to be 95% algae free. Now, when I come back, we're going to talk about what we're going to do if we have an algae problem. There's a couple of different kinds of algae out there that grow, and we don't know why. I think I know why, but I'm a little more anal about the maintenance of tanks. But we're going to talk about that when we come back, and that'll be the tips that I'm going to give you on how to prevent all of this from happening, or if it has happened, how to get rid of it and stop it from coming back. We're going to get to that in just a minute here. Well, first of all, I want to thank you guys for hanging in there with me. I know this has been a long video. I didn't really want it to be this long, but I thought it was such an important subject because, like I said early in the introduction of the video, it's the number one reason why people get out of the hobby, and that's just basically algae and lack of maintenance on their tanks. The one thing that you want to remember is maintenance on a tank is something that if you do it on a regular basis, it's not going to be overwhelming to you. I know there's a tendency for us to get a little bit complacent. I don't want to call it lazy because we all have busy lives, But it's really important that we don't become complacent about the tanks that we have in our homes. Sometimes there's a lot of money put into these tanks, and to just give up on the hobby because we have not taken the time to do that maintenance is, to me, it's kind of silly. And I think that we can easily tell ourselves that if we just do that maintenance and we discipline, did I say maintenance? Whatever I said, you know what? This will fix it. I'm not a big drinker, by the way, but we got a 4-day weekend coming up here, so I just decided today I was going to have a drink while I was doing this video. Anyways, if we do regular maintenance on these tanks and we are never allowing these tanks to get completely out of hand, we're going to be so much better off. And I think that to take, like I said, 30 minutes a week on, and if it's one tank in your home, we're talking 15 minutes a week. You've got a couple of tanks in your home, you're talking 30 minutes a week. But 30 minutes a week to take and do maintenance on your tank on a weekly basis, and then once every 3 months, maybe spend a half hour to 45 minutes doing the vacuuming, the clipping of your plants in the tank to get them looking in pristine shape. All of those things, proper lighting, all of that stuff. If we just do the maintenance on it and we do it correctly, then our tanks are going to look like this all the time. Now this tank here has been running, this is a good example here, this tank has been running for over a year. And the only thing that I've really done to this tank, other than I haven't added any more new fish to it. It's basically the way it was when I set it up originally. And the only thing I've really done is periodically I will add, as I see my budget for this tank, I will add some more plants to it. And there is just one big piece of wood in here that is outside of the rocks that go around, where I can attach by using super glue. Super glue does not harm a tank. I don't want people to think when I said super glue, their eyes light up and go, wow, he's using super glue on a tank. If you use the right kinds of super glue, you go online and look at them. There's several different kinds of super glue out there. You don't have to buy C-Chem or something like that that's a more expensive super glue. There's plenty of them out there that are perfectly safe for an aquarium. And if you want to super glue some new plants to your wood or whatever, just to make it a little bit more bulky, or if some of your plants have yellowed and you want to snip the leaves off and it looks a little barren, add some new Nubius in there, stuff that's really easy to glue down to the wood in your plants or the rocks in your plants. And it really, really is important that we just maintain the tanks. Now, if you already have algae in the tank, let's talk about a couple of things that you can do. First of all, if you see hair algae growing on some of the tips of some of your plants, cut those leaves right off and get rid of them. Cut them right off. The second thing you're going to do after that is you're going to check your water parameters, you're going to check your organics in there. That's likely the most reason why that they're growing any kind of algae on there. And you're also likely to have the light a little bit too close to the plants, and therefore they're getting way more light than they need. And then algae, which is fast growing, can really start to take over the upper parts of the plants on our tanks, and that's where that hair algae is likely to show up. If you've ever noticed hair algae, it usually shows up on the highest points of the tank. There's elkhorn algae, there's several blackbeard algae. I know that's a terrible sounding, horrible type of algae, but it's, like I said, it's easy to get rid of. You clip off the leaves and whatever, and then stick some more planted material in there, and around it, and reduce the light time on your tank would be the first thing to do. Do a few more water changes than maybe you're doing already, and also make sure that your plants are low enough in the tank and your light is high enough in the tank. Most of these lights are adjustable. You can raise the light up a little bit, or if it is a last resort, use what I do here, these little strips of just basically well, they're not really sponge, they're sort of a rubber mat type material. Put those in there, lay them on the top, and what you'll find is, if you see the difference here on how much light there is, and then all of a sudden when you put this in there, you disperse the light, and all of a sudden the light goes out to the edges where the lower parts are, and you don't have the problems. So these are some of the ways that you can reduce or get rid of the algae that's already in your tank. If you're having problems with other kinds of algae and you want to try some experiments, you can take some peroxide, and you can go in there with a solution. You'll have to look it up online because I don't want to tell you something that's going to harm your plants. And there is a way of doing that with peroxide where you take a syringe and you peroxide right around it, and that does kill algae. I've never found it to be really effective, but there are people that tell me that it works really well. You can get some more aggressive snails that will eat different kinds of algae. The problem with that is you're going to find snails that are not going to only eat the algae, they're also going to eat the plants. So it's really a tough thing once algae gets established into your tank. It can be removed, it can be resolved, but the problem is over time it just becomes daunting, and you just want to tear the whole thing down and start over again. Now, I also recommend that about every year you rescape your tank. You just do. You get something new to look at, you get something fun to do. To me, scaping the tank is 99.9% of the fun in doing it in the first place. And if you see that your tank is sort of getting out of hand, it's a great opportunity. Getting out of hand with algae or other things that need maintenance, and it just seems like it's overwhelming to you. Start with a new pallet, man. Don't get rid of your substrate. I don't want to say that. But if you want to change everything up, go right down to your substrate, take all of your fish out of there, put them in a 5-gallon bucket where you put a heater in there and you put a bubble stone in there, and those fish will survive in there for several days until you get your tank back to where you're able to put them back in there. Now, you may have some territorial issues where the fish are going to start fighting for territory and stuff like that. But that's just going to happen, and they'll settle it all out over time, and it's just part of being somebody that keeps fish tanks. You're going to have issues like that. Thank everybody today for hanging in there with me. I know this has been a long video, but I thought it was so important that regardless of how long it was so important that we covered all of these areas about algae. Because, like I said, it's the number one reason why people get out of the hobby, and I don't want people to get out of the hobby. I want you to enjoy your tanks, and I want you to understand that with the minimal amount of maintenance every week on a tank, it is so easy to keep these tanks in 100% condition and really enjoy them and see them for the beauty that they are. Now, I work at home. Maybe it's a little easier for me if you're working out of the house. You know what? Some people say to me, George, I love going into my fish room after I get home and taking care of my fish because it's kind of relieves the stress of the day. And to me, if that's what it does for you, that's great, because your fish are going to benefit, your tank's going to benefit, and so are you personally. You're going to decompress. You're going to have an ability to spend some time alone with your fish and do some maintenance on your tank. Anyways, like, subscribe, and comment if this video is too long, please don't comment about that, because I know it is a long one, but I hope I covered a lot of good areas for you. Also, the bell, man, I'm telling you, I'm not sure if it's up here or up here. I always get it wrong, but the bell's up here somewhere. I'm going to do both because one of them's right. But hit that bell. Any new content that comes out, you're going to be alerted to it, and you're going to see that we have some new content available. I appreciate all the time that you spent with me today. Thank you so much. George here with The Art of Water. We're going to talk again soon. We got some great stuff coming up. We'll talk to you then.